Hello, human geographers. We are back at it again this evening. Tonight, we're going to be looking at a lot of examples of migration, historical migrations, more modern migrations. So let's get started. So we're going to start out with a series of historical migrations. We'll sprinkle in some contemporary examples as well. And when we say historical, what do we mean? We're really talking from 1450 on. Now, why 1450? Well, generally speaking, it's a period of time that's associated with the Renaissance, which then later gives way to the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution and all that. But I actually think that an author, his name is Yuval Noah Harari, put it best in his book Sapiens, where he suggests that now we consider ourselves all one world because we're so interconnected. But it hasn't always been that way. In the book, he actually argues that different civilizations throughout history might as well have lived on different planets with how disconnected they were. The example he uses in the book is that if you lived in Teotihuacan, which was the largest city in the Americas in the 4th century CE, the city of Rome might as well have been on a different planet because it was so far away, it was so disconnected from the Americas. But the historical migrations that really begin with European exploration in the 1450s is a period of time when the Afro-Asian world, which is what you see how it is labeled on the map up there, begins to interact and overtake the other worlds that are listed on the image. So let's take a look at some examples. So the first of the migrations that we're going to look at is from the Iberian Peninsula to what is now Latin America. From Spain and Portugal, the countries of the Iberian Peninsula, many hundreds of thousands of Europeans emigrated to Middle and South America. Now this begins what is known as the Age of Exploration, with Columbus, air quotes, discovering the New World in 1492. Now, notice on there's a treaty called the Treaty of Tordesillas, which was signed in 1494. And the intent of this was to make sure that war didn't break out between Spain and Portugal. So essentially what happened is that Portugal got everything east of that line, and Spain got everything west of that line. Now, this also included colonies in Africa and things as well. But in the terms of Central and South America, we want to look at the impact of this. Portugal got parts of Brazil, Spain got basically everything else. And indigenous populations and their cultures were nearly wiped out by European diseases and were essentially replaced by European cultures. So as a result, European languages like Portuguese in Brazil and Spain, basically everywhere else, as well as Christianity and more specifically Catholicism, dominated the Western Hemisphere. The next migration that we're going to look at is from Europe to what is now Anglo-America or North America, the countries of the United States, Canada. And prior to 1830, about 2.75 million Europeans left to settle overseas. So really not that many people. And examples include the early migration of Puritans escaping religious persecution in England, came to the New World for religious freedom, as well as economic opportunities as well. But between 1835 and 1935, the rate of European emigration increased sharply, with as many as 75 million people departing Europe for colonies in the Americas, but also leaving for areas of Africa, Asia, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. Now, based on the last couple of slides, most of the residents of America are either immigrants or descendants of immigrants. Now, let's kind of explain what's happening in Europe that might have led to this speed up. So we're going to fast forward a little bit from 1450, and we're going to get into the 1800s during the period of time that the Industrial Revolution is taking place and has already felt its impacts. And again, we need to think about this from a demographic standpoint. So Europe, England more specifically, and then it diffuses to other parts of Europe. Enter stage 2 of the demographic transition. So the crude death rate drops and the population soars. And this led to Europe being a source region for migrants. So lots of people are leaving, net out migration, right? But there are other factors that influence that out migration as well. We could look at agricultural reasons like the Irish potato famine. There were economic downturns in Europe, and the fact that because Anglo-America, the United States, Canada are industrializing, there were more job opportunities in countries like the United States. People were escaping religious persecution. And so they were moving to areas through things like chain migration to places where they already knew people of the same background, ethnicity, nationality. And just in general, if there was any kind of political instability, any kind of repression of freedoms, this is something that drove people away, push factors that pushed people to leave Europe and head to North America, more specifically Anglo-America. So let's take a look at modern Europe. So we're talking second half of the 20th century. Well, Europe has become a destination for many migrants from around the world. And in particular, many of these migrants are coming from former European colonies in areas like the Middle East, South Asia, as well as Africa. Now, understand the demographics of what's happening at this time. Europe is in or is moving into stages 4 and 5 of the demographic transition and thus have a larger elderly population, and the potential for a labor shortage is there. There's not enough workers to support the grain population. Where at the same time, many countries, especially in North Africa, for example, are in stage 2 of the demographic transition, and their population is booming. And so they have a lot of workers seeking employment, and so Europe is a natural destination for many of these individuals. And they came especially as guest workers. This is one of our definitions, so here it is. Legal immigrant who has a work visa, usually short term. This is typically seen in more developed countries of Northern and Western Europe, where migrants usually come from Southern and Eastern Europe, but also from North Africa. We could add in many of those former colonies as well, Middle East, regions like that, in search of higher paying jobs. And there's actually some dedicated migration streams to particular areas. For example, many North African workers migrated largely to France. Migrants from Turkey overwhelmingly went to Germany. And then migrants from former colonies in the Caribbean, India, and other parts of Africa largely went to the United Kingdom. And especially in the earlier part of this time period, in the 1960s, the original intent was for many of these workers to fill the void from workers who died during World War II fighting in the war. But many people stayed permanently because the demand was so high, and especially as demographically they moved into stages 4 and 5, made sense. Now, this has led to a changing in the cultural landscape in these regions because as people move there, they bring with them their religions, their languages. And so we've seen many new temples, mosques, restaurants, grocery stores, shops, service industries that are geared towards migrants who have taken roots in European countries with large guest worker populations. So to give some context for this next migration, Europeans colonized the Americas as well as the coasts of Africa and parts of Asia between the 1500s to the 1800s. Now, in contrast to what happened in the Americas, in Africa and Asia, many people shared the same diseases that were carried by Europeans. Go back to that first slide. It was called the Afro-Asian world, and notice that it included Europe, Africa, and Asia. And so as a result, we didn't see nearly as many people die from the exposure of new diseases. So European cultures mixed with the existing cultures rather than replacing them like they did in the Americas. Many people largely kept their traditional languages and religions, but some learned to speak European languages and converted to European religions. Now, in this particular case, the textbook that this comes from, they refer to this migration as from the British Isles to the British Empire. So let's take a look at Great Britain more specifically. So the British moved largely to coastal areas in sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Australia, New Zealand, and this was the beginnings of the British Empire. You might have heard the phrase, the sun never set on the British Empire. And this is the beginnings of that. And it was a largely economic migration, but there were also some demographic characteristics. So, for example, for about 50 years, beginning in 1788, Great Britain shipped tens of thousands of convicts from Britain to Australia, impacting the population and the culture of the continent because, as with the Americas, Australia had not been exposed to these European diseases. So huge numbers of native Australians died as a result. And so as a result, like America, most of Australia's residents are either immigrants or descendants of immigrants. Now, you might have noticed on the last slide, India is not included. And that's largely because not nearly as many British subjects made the move to India as they did to some of these other areas. So we're talking about a lot of people moving. Now, that doesn't mean that India is not going to be important. It will be here very shortly. So our next migration is a little bit different because this is the first migration that is not a voluntary migration. This is the largest forced migration in world history, and this is the transatlantic slave trade. Numbers vary a little bit. Probably the most consistent numbers are around 12 million. But in some of the other human geography textbooks, the numbers range as high as 30 million people were forcibly taken from Africa and sent across the Atlantic to serve as slaves in the Americas. Now, many Africans lost their lives just crossing to the Western Hemisphere, not even including the treatment that they got once they actually arrived. This particular migration is referred to as being from West Africa to the Caribbean, South America, and the American South. And I think it's important to understand the order of that because take a look at the map. First off, what type of map are we looking at? Notice that the size of the arrow varies. This is a graduated symbol map. And so several different arrows are going to the Caribbean: Dutch Caribbean, French Caribbean, Danish Caribbean, British Caribbean, okay? Because the largest number of West African slaves went to the Caribbean. Then you had many more that went to Brazil, whereas the fewest number went to the American South, British North America, as it is listed on this particular graphic. That's not to underplay the importance that it would have, particularly in American history, but it's important to understand the significance of this from a contemporary standpoint. So let's take a look at some contemporary examples and look at the impact of this forced migration. Now, in the Caribbean, the vast majority of people on many of the islands of the Caribbean are of African Caribbean descent, and few, if any, indigenous peoples still remain. In Jamaica, for example, 90% of the population identifies as being of African descent, and in Haiti, the number is 95%. Now, in South America, there's kind of an interesting example of what came out of this forced migration of West Africans. Because so many Africans were taken from an area in West Africa that is now Benin to an area in Brazil known as Bahia, significant elements of the local culture from what is now Benin remained intact in the transition to South America. And so today, Bahia and Benin actually still have very strong ties, and cultural exchanges still take place between these two continents. And then remember that the smallest number of West African slaves went to the American South. But I want to talk about what happened after the end of slavery and what took place in the period of time up to now. And so I want to start by looking at what took place in the early 20th century. This is known as the Great Migration. So in the early part of the 1900s, tens of thousands of African American families from the South moved to industrial cities of the Northeast and Midwest. New industrial innovations meant that many of the agricultural jobs that they had worked were now not as plentiful, as well as Jim Crow laws were being enacted that separated blacks and whites in areas like schools, hospitals, public spaces, public transportation, and even cemeteries. So we can actually take a look at the numbers of this over time. Now, remember we said that the Great Migration began in the early part of the 20th century, so early 1900s. And you can see that in 1910, 82% of the African American population of the United States was largely clustered in the American South. This is a good example of a graduated symbol map. And only 18% were in northern states and out west. Now, between 1910 and 1970, it's estimated that between 5 and 8 million African Americans migrated from the South to northern cities, cities like Chicago, cities like Detroit and Baltimore, to the point where by the 1970s, 60% of the population of African Americans in the United States were living outside of the South, particularly in northern cities. What you can see, graduated symbol map, that many moved out west as well, and still 40% living in the South. Now, in kind of an interesting reversal, we've actually seen that many African Americans, because of disillusionment and deteriorating living conditions in the Rust Belt of urban North and West, coupled with growing economic opportunities in southern cities, actually we've seen African Americans moving back to the South, particularly to the large cities of the South. So if you take a look at this graphic, which again is a graduated symbol map, you'll notice that the top 5 areas that have been losing African Americans have been New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, cities all in the north or out west. And the top 5 cities that have been gaining where African Americans have been moving: Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, Miami, Washington, referring to Washington, D.C., cities that are all in the South. So we mentioned a few minutes ago that India was going to play a larger role in looking at these historical migrations, and here we are. So what happened was, after the British outlawed slavery throughout their colonies, we saw that many Indians were brought to other British colonies to serve in administrative roles, in commercial roles, and the British, who at that point had colonized South Asia, transported tens of thousands of what were known as indentured workers from present-day India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, in particular to East and South Africa. But the British also extended out to the Malay Peninsula, including Singapore, as well as their Pacific holdings, including Fiji. So we're going to see the long-term effect of that here in just a moment. So we could call this one From India to the British Empire. And again, as slavery ends, the British need workers on their plantations, harvesting raw materials, and the Indians served that purpose. So today, people of South Asian ancestry are substantial minorities in countries like South Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, and long before the British arrived in India, Hindu influences had radiated out into parts of Southeast Asia, in particular the country of Indonesia and the islands of Java and Bali. And so this is more commonly known as the Indian diaspora. Diaspora, one of our vocabulary terms, and it means to disperse. And it is a forced or voluntary dispersal of a particular group of people, in this case Indians, from their homeland, India, or South Asia, the Indian subcontinent, to a new place, and that new place in this case being British colonies around the world. So to see the impact of this today, Southeast Asia, Indonesia still has a fairly small Hindu minority, in particular on the island of Bali. In Fiji, Hindus are the second largest ethnic group. In Guyana, 28.4% of the population self-identifies as Hindu. And in Suriname, Hindustani represents the largest ethnic group in the country. Our next migration that we're going to take a look at is taking place during the 19th and 20th century, so late 1800s and into the early 1900s. Millions of Chinese laborers fled things like famine as well as political strife in southern China to work as contract laborers in mainly Southeast Asia, but you'll notice that they migrated into the more sparsely inhabited parts of northern China, but they also migrated to Western North America. And so this is more commonly known as the Chinese diaspora. So dispersal of a particular group of people, Chinese, from their homeland, China, to someplace else, particularly Southeast Asia, but also Western North America. And I think it's important to note Western North America because this is a good example of distance decay. Now, obviously the Pacific Ocean, very, very large, so it's not a perfect example, but if you're crossing that ocean, where are you most likely to end up? Well, you're most likely to end up in the place that's closest to where you began, and that was Western North America. And so, because so many Chinese migrated for economic reasons, this actually became known as the Bamboo Network. So I included a link there, hey, talking about what the Bamboo Network is, but essentially it was this idea that we had close-knit Chinese families and entrepreneurs that had large economic ties throughout mainly Southeast Asia, but also Western North America. And so to see the impact of this today, we actually see that many people of Chinese ancestry constitute large populations in parts of Southeast Asia. 14% of the population in Thailand, 23% of the population in Malaysia, and they are the second largest ethnic group in Malaysia, but persecuted largely because there was this perception that Chinese were moving to Malaysia to earn money to send it back to China, remittances. And to be honest, that's exactly what was happening. That's part of what this Bamboo Network was. Money flowed out of China to support new businesses that were starting, and once they started to make a profit, that money started to flow back to families in China. The population of Singapore is 76.8% ethnically Chinese. In Indonesia, they constitute a fairly small minority, only about 3% of the population. But remember that Indonesia is the fourth largest country on earth in terms of population, so that's a fairly substantial amount of people. In North America, we see large Chinese populations in Seattle, in San Francisco, in Vancouver. But in Anglo-America, in particularly the United States, migration from China combined with this concept known as xenophobia, which is a strong dislike of people who practice a different culture, another culture, actually prompted the U.S. Congress to ban almost all migration from China between the years of 1882 and 1943. A little bit more on that later. Our next migration that we're going to take a look at is from the eastern part of North America to the western part of North America. So again, eastern part of North America, that's where the population center is clustered. And so the expansion was to areas that were more open out west. And perhaps you remember from your U.S. history classes in middle school, you remember what this was known as. It was known as manifest destiny. And this was this idea in the 1800s that Americans would eventually expand all the way to the Pacific Ocean, from sea to shining sea. And you actually saw this a lot in American culture at that time. You could see paintings of it, songs about it, newspaper articles. That's actually where the term manifest destiny came from. It was coined by a newspaper writer. And so we can actually see that throughout much of American history. And if you notice the image in the bottom right, that is looking at the geographic center of the population. So if the country balanced on a pinhead, basically, where would it find its equilibrium? Where would it be balanced with all the people in the country? And without fail, every single census, which is conducted how long? Every 10 years. The geographic center of the population has moved westward. Without fail, there's not a single exception to that. Every single census, it has moved westward. Now, some years it moves faster than others because, for example, in 1862, the Homestead Act offered land to settlers as long as they farmed it for 5 years, and that was intended to encourage westward expansion. So there were policies that the U.S. government instituted that facilitated westward expansion. Now, also keep in mind that Native Americans were forcibly relocated westward to Oklahoma, what is now Oklahoma, then known as the Indian Territory. We talked about that in a previous lecture. So the reality is that for more than 2 centuries, a migration stream has carried the geographic center of the population westward. And more recently, it has also moved to the south. Now, it hasn't been always that way, but every year, every census, I should say, it has moved westward. So our final big historical migration that we're going to take a look at is from Western Russia to Eastern Russia. It's a kind of a mirror image of what took place in Anglo-America, in North America. And the reality is that Russians were moving from the population centers, which is around cities like Moscow, St. Petersburg, things like that, into Siberia as well as into Central Asia. And this is the largest country on earth. And so different rulers during the Tsarist regime from the 1800s into the early 1900s, and during the communist period from the 1920s into the 1980s, Russian and Soviet rulers tried to occupy and consolidate the largest country on earth, and they tried to, in particular, consolidate the far eastern frontier. And so this eastward expansion from the western population centers included moving industries eastward, building railroads like the Trans-Siberian Railroad and feeder lines, and establishing Vladivostok on the Pacific Ocean, which is one of the world's best equipped naval bases. Now, during the communist period, the Soviet government actually employed a policy known as Russification, which sought to assimilate all the people in the Soviet territory into Russian culture. And one way that the Soviets pushed for Russification was by encouraging people of Russian heritage to move out of Moscow, out of St. Petersburg, and fill in the rest of the country. And by 1980, as many as 30 million Russians had moved out toward the borders. Now, during that Soviet Union, especially during Stalin's regime of the late 20s and up to 1953, the government forcibly moved millions of non-Russians from their homes to remote parts of Central Asia and Siberia for political purposes. Now, in much the same way that Native Americans were moved, what about Native Siberians? They were handled very much the same way. They were set up on reservations. They were set up on the worst land to make way for people of Russian heritage as they moved eastward. And so this is what our final map would look like with all of these 8 historical migrations included on it. Not necessarily something that you need to have memorized, but as far as good case studies, good examples of what has happened in terms of huge numbers of people moving, it is fairly important. So shifting gears here, now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the patterns of migration into the U.S. And we could break them down into 3 phases, basically. The first one was the American colonial period. So 1600s, even into the early parts of what is now the United States. So we'll say 1808. And largely this was European settlement, mainly British, but of course we already talked about the West African slave trade, so a lot of enslaved Africans were brought as well. Well, in 1808, the slave trade is outlawed in the United States. And at that point, a lot of the migration shifts to parts of Europe. In particular, parts of Europe that are undergoing industrialization. So as that industrial revolution technology diffuses, they move into stage 2 of the DTM, population booms, and a lot of people move out. So up until about the 1880s, so Western Europe comes during the mid-1800s, Northern Europe comes during the later 1800s, the U.S. didn't place many restrictions on immigration. The ratio to the amount of farmland, there was so much, and the amount of workers, there weren't enough, that immigrants were often welcome. But that isn't always the case, because it wasn't uncommon to see signs that called for help but said, "No Irish need apply." And some of that hostility actually ramped up into the early part of the 1900s when, so late 1800s, 1890s, into the first part of the 20th century, up to about the start of World War I, we saw a lot of migration from Southern and Eastern Europe. And we saw hostility with people there. And then since the end of World War II, 1945 till present, most of the migration has actually come from Latin America and Asia. And in the 1940s, the U.S. government encouraged Mexicans to move to the U.S. as contract workers, which is another name for guest workers, in what is known as the Bracero program. And so there was actually some encouragement of migration from Latin America, in particular in Mexico. Now, there were periods of decline, particularly around conflicts, so the US Civil War, World War I, World War II, and economic decline. So mid 1890s, the 1893 Depression, and the Great Depression, we saw big valleys in the amount of migration. And so this is just a visualization of kind of what we were talking about. So the areas in green were Northern and Western Europe. We see peaks in the mid 1800s into the later 1800s. That's when it shifts to the yellow, which is Southern and Eastern Europe. And then after World War II, we see a lot more from Asia, which is blue, Latin America, which is red, and Africa, it's difficult to see, is actually a purple layer on top of the red. And so there's different periods of migration. One of my favorite graphics to look at deals with migration from Northern Europe. And so here's a visualization looking at people moving from Scandinavia to the United States and largely where they settled. So yeah, a lot of people settled in New York. Think Ellis Island makes sense. Okay? But also a lot of people moved further west. And notice this is a graduated symbol map that a lot of people settled in Minnesota. And I always like to draw a connection between topics that we're learning about, like migration, and culture. Because if you know the National Football League team, the NFL team in Minnesota, they are the Minnesota Vikings. Any surprise given the fact that so many Scandinavians moved to that part of the country? So there's a lot of connections between popular culture and some of the topics that we're learning about. But again, taking a look at parts of like Southern and Eastern Europe, there was a lot of political instability with things like the Russian Revolution, lack of jobs moving into stage 2 that served as push factors. And the US offered economic opportunities. We had undergone industrialization. We needed a lot of workers, particularly in areas like construction, transportation, things like that. And in the second half of the 20th century, we've seen the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, so we saw that as a push factor. The fact that countries in Latin America, Asia, and even now Africa are moving into stage 2 and early stage 3, and there's a lot of population growth. And anytime there's ethnic or religious conflict, that would also serve as a push factor. And so the US, again, serves as a pull factor because there's a lot of, in particular, low-wage work, what we would consider low-wage, but compared to the wages in the source region, might actually be a little bit higher. We've seen a lot more workers in things like agribusiness. We've seen demand for workers in ethnic economies, working in different types of grocery stores, religious institutions, things like that, as well as the need for workers in high-tech industries, so people with a background in software or hardware production. That serves as a pull, so we see brain drain happening in Asia, Latin America, and they're moving here where we need workers. Now, one of the things that I always like to draw attention to is that spike. If you notice on the last slide, there was a big spike in the 1980s. Was that because so many people moved during the late 1980s? Well, let's understand what this is. In 1986, the U.S. passed a piece of legislation called the Immigration Reform and Control Act, known as IRCA. And that legislation gave amnesty and permanent residence to 2.6 million migrants who had been living in the United States for a long period of time. So newly legal migrants under IRCA could move anywhere, and during the 1990s, many moved to the Great Plains, Midwest, as well as areas of the South. And so this was a piece of legislation that really just recognize people who are already here. So that spike isn't necessarily mean that more people moved here, but rather that we recognized people who had been undocumented, and now for the first time ever they were documented, they were put on the books as far as migrants in the United States. So this is an interesting graphic. It's, well, let's do some four-level analysis on it. First off, what is this? It's a map looking at U.S. immigration destinations by region of origin. So where they're coming from and where they settle. Okay. At what scale are we analyzing this? Well, this is the subnational, and notice that we can see counties. It's at the county scale. And what type of map are we looking at? Well, we're looking at a choropleth map. So what patterns do you notice? Four-level analysis. What patterns do you notice? Then what might explain that? And think about a little bit, what do you think this means for the future? And that's where we'll end tonight. Have a wonderful evening, everyone, and I'll see you back in class.